Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined again by Eugene Montsalvat. Thanks for coming on again.
My pleasure.
Today we're going to discuss Prussian Socialism, which is the title, of course, of Oswald Spengler's work, which we will discuss, but we won't be limited to that. Now, Prussia, we won't go into minute detail, but its ultimate roots go back to the Teutonic Knights and the Teutonic Order, which settled in Livonia and East Prussia and set up the kingdom there. And then, of course, also in Brandenburg. And the two were later joined by marriage after the Reformation. And Prussia, as we would come to know it, came, I think, with the Great Elector in 1688 or something around there. And Europe at the time of the 18th century was largely influenced by the works of English capitalist thinkers like Adam Smith. And in Europe, the first really contrary or challenging position did develop in Prussia. One of the first continental economic theories that was in challenge to Smith was in Prussia. And one of its first writers was Fichte and his The Closed Commercial State. So do you have any thoughts or anything to say about the Prussian origin of European anti-Smithian economics?
Yes, I mean, it goes back even to the monastic state, which was based around this communal idea of the church originally with the Teutonic Knights. It was basically a cooperative form of economics. There was also a very militarized one. So they were basically crusaders going out into what was then pagan territory of the various Baltic tribes, mixing with these tribes, assimilating them. So they started with this military order, this monastic order that was based around these cooperative communal principles, though they were also under constant siege. So they developed this sort of fortress-like mentality that would become a sort of Prussian hallmark.
Yeah. In fact, while not mentioning the Teutonic Knights by name, in his work Prussian Socialism, Oswald Spengler does contrast the English and German economic models by saying that the English economic model is the Viking model of raiding and exploring, and the German model is like the medieval knight, based on feudal systems of oaths of fealty and duty obligations. Which is largely correct, though, as you said, it's more specific. It's the Teutonic Order with its unique religious. Do you think that the monastic nature of the order was instrumental in carrying over into Prussian culture itself? A lot of that sort of discipline and cooperative aspect to the Prussian culture, I think, can be traced back to its roots in the order.
Yes, why one could say that there's a certain Protestant ethos imposed upon that after the Reformation. It was extant in the Catholic phase as well.
Max Weber in his Protestant work ethic, the spirit of capitalism and the Protestant work ethic, he argues that Protestantism took the monastic work ethic out of the cloister and into the world at large.
Yes, I would say that's a very accurate statement, that everyone was expected in this new Prussian state under Protestantism to behave like they were a knight. They were a contributing member of the community. They were part of a greater thing. That there's not so much an individualist ethos, which you see with England. It's very cooperative. And that goes back to the whole land-sea dichotomy as well. In England, you have this idea of the raider capitalist system, whereas in Prussian, you have this cooperative agrarian towards an industrial system later on.
Yeah. And now, while that certainly was a continuous trend in the history of Prussia, in the mid to late 18th century, English capitalist thought with people like John Law and Adam Smith and David Hume were the sort of dominant economic philosophies even on the continent. And we see that in beginning around the time of Napoleon, we see different European nations articulating different answers to the capitalist question raised by Smith and Hume. And one of Prussia's first attempts was Fichte in the closed commercial state. Now, recently I've been reading E. Michael Jones's The Barren Metal, His History of Usury. And in it, he talks about Fichte and the closed commercial state, which in many ways kind of predicts the 20th century East German, North Korean states, where exports are strictly regulated by the government, immigration is strictly regulated by the government, what's produced and how it's consumed is strictly regulated by the government. Because Fichte argued that free trade and capitalism, contrary to Smith and Hume, didn't produce peace, but produced competition and more warfare. And so the only way in his mind, to stop the competition and warfare was to stop trading, which seems to be a little bit too far.
Perhaps. Fichte is sort of responding to Kant's idea of what does it take to create perpetual peace in Europe. And so he saw that you'd have to have economies dealing with each other in the same way they deal diplomatically. As closed states, they can't be in flux across each other's boundaries. You can't have a state with jurisdiction outside of it, and you can't have an economy with jurisdiction outside of it. And so he develops this idea of the closed autarkic state, which he would say would provide a basis for peace among European nations and lead to peace in Europe.
Yeah, that was definitely his intent. But if I'm not mistaken, in the closed commercial state, he argues that, for instance, you shouldn't buy exports from other countries, so you might have to do without, Dutch China or American tobacco if you lived in Germany.
Yes, which was actually a part of the Frederick the Great's idea about creating home-based German industries. Particularly, he wanted to have a home-based German silk industry to get rid of the Chinese imports and porcelain as well.
Yeah, and I think now, on the one hand, from a purely pragmatic international perspective, that makes a lot of sense. Strategic resources, heavy industry, which admittedly didn't exist then but does now, if produced by foreigners, leaves you at a distinct disadvantage in times of war, because if you don't make cars, that means you don't make tanks. And if you go to war with somebody that can make tanks and you have to import them and they blockade you, well, then you're in a pretty pickle there.
Yes, it's the whole idea of the economics of power is that if you are enthralled to an importer of basic war material, you can't make war upon them. You have no separate diplomatic existence outside of the countries you're importing the basic materials for war.
Exactly, and that's in fact what Germany's position was in World War I and World War II, and in fact what Germany sought to rectify but wasn't allowed to.
Yes, Germany's major idea about expanding into, say, Romania in World War II was to get oil so it could be autarkic from the international oil trade.
Exactly. And it's interesting in the 19th century with German economic development. I don't know a lot about German political economy of the 19th century, but one interesting aspect was the prevalence of cartelization. Cartels were a prominent feature of that system, and it's in part due to the guild system. The guild system in Europe and in Germany in particular lasted longer than in places like England. And that guild medieval attitude carried over into the industrial world in Germany.
Yes. Germany as a unified nation doesn't emerge until 1871. So even into the Napoleonic era, it was very feudal. And so you get this influence from the guild system. Also from Prussia, the Prussian state adopts this idea that you can have these big corporations that are working very closely with the states, very dirigiste. This idea of sort of a directed state economy without private ownership, but it's directed for the needs of the state. In many ways, it's sort of like the idea of Gaullism in France, where you have these major corporations that are working very closely with state planners.
Yeah. Now, in the case of Italian fascism and German National Socialism, companies were not nationalized like in the Soviet Union, but again served the national interest. Are there any significant differences between the Gaullist Prussian system and the fascist National Socialist system, or is it just by degrees?
It's a matter of degree, really. I think that National Socialism originally wanted to be more hands-on with the economy, particularly with the Strassers and the Rome, even Goebbels to a degree. You had, in the original manifesto, they wanted the nationalization of large sections of German industry, particularly the war industry, the seizure of war profits. Now, once you get to the point where Hitler enters the scene, becomes the chancellor, there's a certain sense of reaction against this. Hitler has to appeal to many of the wealthier, larger sections of German society. And so these more radical socialist elements within the German nationalist socialist movement are purged.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that fundamentally divides German and economic intellectual thought from one another is the fact that in English economic thought, and by extension America and the Anglosphere, is that the economy is reducible to individuals interacting for their mutual self-interest. Whereas in the German, and one could even argue the wider European context, the economy is seen as an organic living organism of society, where society itself is a sort of emergent property out of people interacting together. And so the society then creates this kind of superimposed order spontaneously onto society, to the individuals. And so that's the level at which economic calculation, economic action is valued at, whereas in the Anglosphere, it's purely at the individual level.
Yes, there's this great German economist, Friedrich List, who's sort of the founder of the idea that the fundamental actor in the economy is not the individual, but the nation. And so his critique of Smith is that whereas Smith builds on individual interactions, for Friedrich List, who was the sort of godfather of German nationalist economics, the idea that a nation would be sort of this protected by a standard economic policy that would encourage the national industry. The basic fundamental principle of List's economics is the nation rather than the individual. So he opposes free trade and advocates a custom union surrounding all these various German states that would one day become the unified German nation.
Yeah, and isn't it the case that Friedrich List was in some extent inspired by Alexander Hamilton and the American system of economics?
Yes. Friedrich List had spent time in the United States and had taken this idea about a nationalist protectionist regime to encourage infantile industry, and he brought that over to Germany.
Yeah. Now, the customs union that you mentioned, was that the Zollverein?
Yes, that's the Zollverein.
And that, of course, was a precondition for the unification of Germany itself. In many ways, by having free trade between the German states, but not outside of that, it then bound them together and gave them a common sense of identity that they didn't quite have before.
Yes, particularly the introduction of the railroads. It was, in many ways, the unification of Germany was almost dependent on a technological explosion where industry and railroads linked with each other in different states, and they've coalesced to form the German nation.
Yeah. Now, Friedrich List is known for his what's called the national system. So why don't you explain what the national system is?
The national system is this idea that there ought to be a tariff barrier around that would protect these infantile industries, and that the state takes an active hand in encouraging the growth of industry. It's not laissez-faire, it's very dirigiste, it's very protectionist. It's in direct competition with the Smithian idea that there should be the elimination of monopolies, there should be the elimination of state-granted economic privileges. For List, the role of the state's very paramount in building these industries in the nation, in protecting them and fostering the growth and guiding their development.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting, the free market school will say, all things equal, free market economies are more productive and more successful than their competition. But one of the interesting things is in any sort of cursory introduction to World War I, people will tell you that 1913 is kind of the year of peak economic production that everybody compares back to for the next 20 years after the devastation wrought by the war. And if I'm not mistaken, in 1913, Germany exceeded England in steel production, despite
Yeah.
the fact that England ruled a quarter of the world and followed Smithian economics. So it is interesting that that prediction doesn't bear itself out vis-a-vis England and the Germany.
Yes, for Germany, there was a very close relation with the military industries, steel, armaments, and the state that the English industries didn't really benefit from.
Yeah, and in many ways, the United States had a similar system where the United States government facilitated and built the railroads.
Yes, yes, and it's interesting to note that all these countries that later adopt this free market, anti-tariff ideology, they adopt it after their infantile industry had developed under the protection of tariffs.
Yeah, that does seem to be the case. I mean, even England developed its industry under the Navigation Acts passed by Oliver Cromwell. And then I think they only became fully free trade after the repeal of the Corn Laws, right, in 1850?
Yes, yes, in the 1840s. So England had just started the Industrial Revolution as a protectionist nation.
Yeah, pretty much all of the great European and American powers did that. Now, were there any other interesting? The other threat of German economics from the 19th century is, of course, Karl Marx. Though, of course, he wasn't strictly speaking a Prussian, but he did. I think Karl Marx did believe that Germany would be the nation that would first become communist. So maybe you can go into the reasons why Marx thought that.
Well, he thought that because of this huge transition that was going on in Germany at the time into the industrial era, where you had this upheaval of workers coming in from agrarian backgrounds into industry. And when these workers were moving into the big cities and stuff, it was leading to a lot of slums, social breakdown, crime, disease, etc. And so Bismarck comes onto the scene, and Bismarck is sort of the first Keynesian. He's seeing the problems with capitalism developing, and so Bismarck creates the German welfare state to avoid the potential of a socialist uprising. Yeah,
it's now with Karl Marx, he actually. Karl Marx and also his colleague Engels, and I think Engels wrote more of this. It's little known, but they actually wrote military history and military analysis. And Engels was deeply impressed by the Prussian military system.
Yes. And so there's
go ahead, sir.
There's a certain influence on Marxism with Werner Sombart, the great Prussian economist, this idea of the German. So Sombart goes from Marxism to a more German nationalist stance. He studied Marx and he corresponded with Engels. And so he takes this idea of the class conflict, but he imposes it on nations themselves, the idea of the mercantile nation versus the heroic nation.
Besides Fichte and List and Marx, are there any other 19th century German economists that you think would be of interest or note?
Well, he wasn't so much an economist as a statesman, but Baron von Stein is very much cited by the Strassers because he oversaw this great land redistribution in Prussia from the large magnates to small farming people. And the Strassers say that he did this at the exact moment when France was threatening Germany. This was in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. And they saw this turn towards a more equitable distribution as a fundamental element of German national liberation. So you get this interplay between German socialism and nationalism, that's appearing under Baron von Stein, where he's taking land from the big magnates and giving it to the small farmers to give them a share in the Prussian society.
Because presumably if people don't have a stake in the system, they can't be counted on to be reliable in defending the nation.
Yes. And so it's also breaking down the power of these big feudal magnates who were sort of localizing the power in themselves and preventing the power from being centralized in the German state. So by going above the heads of these feudal magnates, he was creating a basis for a popular German state.
Yeah, it's somewhat analogous, well, not identical, but somewhat analogous to the reforms by Tomoyoshi Hideyoshi in feudal Japan. When he united Japan, he had all these shoguns with castles and private armies. And he was like, well, that's a bad idea. That's what led to the war in the first place. So he leveled all the castles and confiscated all the samurai swords to centralize power into the what would later become the Tokugawa shogunate.
Yes, that's a good. Von Stein wasn't as extreme. He did compensate the landowners for the redistribution of land, but the idea was basically the same: to take the power from these squabbling magnates and put it in the hands of a central state.
It also reminds me of Taiwan. In the 1950s, Chiang Kai-shek began a series of reforms that transferred land from the landholders to the people that worked the land. And it was a complex process. One step was kind of a rent to own. The people that would work the land would pay rent, but that rent would be it's kind of a down payment on the land, up to maybe 70% of the total value. And then the rest of the value of the land would be compensated by these landlords receiving shares in the up-and-coming state industries, which, as we know, became quite lucrative as the tech industry.
Yes, it's very much similar to what Chiang Kai-shek did in Taiwan, in that it was a compensated transfer of land from these magnates to the smaller peasantry, to the yeomanry, and it broke the power of these feudal lords. It's very much a transition from the feudal state to the nation state, and that's basically what Chiang Kai-shek was doing. That's what Baron von Stein was doing.
Do you think now in Malaysia during the insurgency with the communists, one of the things that had to happen during the war was the British realized that they had to redress the land problem. That was the main argument the Marxists would make to the peasants. And if the British realized if they were going to win this insurgency, they had to fix the land problem. Now, due to Baron von Stein's reforms, do you believe that's in part why Germany never suffered a communist revolution, or at least a successful one?
Yes, in part, because I gave the German peasant a share in the state, and also it solidified the basis of the peasantry. Whereas for Marxism, and class struggle is all about the urbanized proletariat. Whereas in Germany, they gave the peasant a further existence. The peasantry wasn't going to be wiped out by the forces of technology. And so this class struggle in the urban proletariat didn't really develop because of the strength of the German peasantry, who became the backbone of a more conservative Prussian state.
Yeah, and it's funny, in England, as a contrast with the enclosure laws, which confiscated the commons and many lands of the peasants, it did create that urban proletariat mass, which probably became the backbone of the Labour Party, right?
Yes. It was almost the exact opposite in England, where you had the centralization of land in the hands of big landowners.
The new feudal lords.
Yes, disenfranchising the old smallholders.
Yeah, because traditionally England had been a land of small landholders, going back to Anglo-Saxon times. And the great centralization took place after capitalism rather than before it, as in other places in Europe.
Yes. So it creates this great mass of people who are untethered from the land, who become the urban proletariat. Now, it's very interesting that there was no communist revolution in England. And I'd probably say that's due to, once again, the strength of the Labour Party and various socialist alternatives to communism.
that alleviated the worst grievances of the people. Um, you know, in many ways, this whole methodology is very old of the proletariat mob, though it's somewhat anachronistic. The late Roman Republic suffered from a similar problem after numerous decades at war. When the soldiers came home, the yeomen, their wives and children had sold off their farms to the patricians because they couldn't work them. And you had this large mob of well-trained soldiers with nowhere to go. And that led to the kind of politicking of Marius, Sulla, and finally Julius Caesar. And it's interesting because I think Oswald Spengler points out, I don't remember where, but that the communist forces, the rabble-rousers, the socialists, have been, in many cases, been in service to the corporate elite. And he mentions the Romans, how Caesar was funded by wealthy patricians from Spain. And then he also points out, I think, the Wall Street backers of the Bolsheviks. So there's this connection between the wealthy landlords who want to centralize land under their control and funding these rabble-rousers to scare people in a certain direction.
Yes, yes. With the case of Rome, they were giving these people, they were feeding them, they were giving them corn. So these private patricians, they had their own armies, essentially. They were creating their own little private welfare states to essentially battle each other.
Exactly. I mean, Caesar and Sulla, their guys were like, we give you food, we give you a pension, just help us, maintain power, and it worked. As we get into the early 20th century, probably one of the most influential schools of economics, well, late 19th, early 20th century, is the historical school. And that's largely a German invention to the likes of Max Weber and Gustav von Schmoller. Why don't you introduce the historical school?
Well, the historical school, it's sort of working on a very different basis. It sort of tracks the progress of history and the development of social forces. It's not a basically strict rationalist where you have Adam Smith, you have this sort of strict rationalist idea that people are just individual atoms exchanging goods for their greatest possible benefit. For the historical school, it's taking into effect the idea of social forces, religion, culture, politics. And so it's a contrast to this individualist school because it's very much focused on the beliefs and evolution of society.
Yeah. And two of the most famous historical school thinkers, were, of course, Max Weber and Werner Sombart. So why don't you give a little bit of background on Weber and Sombart?
Well, Weber's most famous for his theory on the Protestant ethic, the Protestant work ethic, how it contributed to the spirit of capitalism, particularly with Calvinism and the idea that God will reward you for your hard work. For Sombart, there's also this idea about the mercantile and heroic, and the idea that certain peoples are more mercantile or heroic. For Sombart, the heroic idea was this ideal of service. What can I render to society? For the idea of the mercantile was, what can I take from society? So Sombart develops this national character idea in economics, where the character of the German economy is more heroic. Of course, there may be mercantile people within Germany, but the character of the German people as a whole is more heroic, whereas the English are more mercantile. They're more focused on what can I get for myself. And of course, he elucidates this at the time of the First World War. The idea, there's a certain sense of war propaganda going into this. So it's not entirely 100% unbiased, but the distinction he draws between the English national character and the German national character, I think, is quite accurate.
I would tend to agree as well. And with the historical school, I really appreciate their again sensitivity to culture, to religion, and to how these things affect us. Whereas it seems like the free market school just tends to sort of abstract mankind out of history It's like he's abstracted out of history. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, the philosopher Hegel argued that when people abstract a concept out of its context, it's useful to do that in a sort of scientific experimental sense where you get to analyze the idea independent of its context. But it's never really actually independent of the context. When you act like it is, then you run into trouble. And I think you could argue that the free market schools of Smith and others, when they abstract man out of his actual flesh and blood context of family, religion, culture, tradition, and then you act like it's like that's real, then you run into problems.
Well, the sort of individualist capitalist liberal school begins with this abstract notion of man that's totally disconnected from any historical perspective. The Comte de Maille, the great French counter-revolutionary, said, "I've never seen this abstract man. I've seen the Frenchman, I've seen the Englishman, I've seen the Persian and the Chinese, but there is no abstract man." And so the beginning of this liberal capitalist school is this straw man figure who has no qualities outside that he's a purely rational atomic actor.
He's almost a mathematical concept.
It's purely a mathematical concept.
Yeah. Now, Oswald Spengler, where would he fit into this system of schools? Is he a kind of maverick on his own, or does he fit nicely into some known economic school?
I would definitely put him more along the lines of the historical school, though I don't think he's an economic thinker per se, so much as a civilizational thinker. And so he's putting the concepts of economics where they fit into the rise and fall of civilizations. That civilizations rise very collectively and then fall when they become very individualist, decadent, luxurious, where it becomes about the individual.
Mm-hmm. So as long as, if you serve the interest of the individual, that's actually a sign of the last decadent days of a society, rather than the serving the interests of the community as a whole.
Yes, for Spengler, you get this sense of collective destiny in a culture that gives rise to a civilization. And then within the civilization, there's the decline, where you lose this sense of irrational destiny and now are forced to think in abstract rationalist terms, try to force things together to work mechanically. And from that comes individualism, liberalism, and the decline of the civilization.
Yeah. One of the interesting economic insights that I think Spengler has is in his essay, Prussian Socialism. And he mentions that what he conceives by that is a society that's run by strict rules, like a game of chess. The rules there's a strict set of rules that govern society, but you're free to make a move, right? You can only move a pawn a certain way or a knight a certain way. So the moves you can make are limited, but not what moves you make. You have the free choice to make whatever move you want, as long as it's within the set of the rules. And so Spengler's arguing that within this system, this German socialist system, you have strict guidelines, but within those guidelines, you have free choice to act in your self-interest.
Yes, it's very much this idea of the Prussian state, that you are given a share in the state and it is yours to manage for the benefit of the state, but it is yours to manage. So there's not this absolute total planning, but there's this greater planning for the state, and the actors themselves have a certain freedom within that.
Now, we mentioned that a lot of this can be traced back to the Teutonic Knights, but this idea that we're kind of like a holder of property and we use it for the common good. Now, in this case, it's the common good of the state. But I can't help be reminded of some of the parables that Jesus told, where we're in a sense tenants. We have been given land or responsibility, but it's not ours to dispose of at our pleasure. We have to use it for some greater purpose for which we will have to give an account someday. So do you think that this German socialist model is in some sense inspired by Christianity?
Oh yes, most certainly. The idea of stewardship is a very Prussian idea. The idea of sort of this Protestant ethic of service. That is a very Prussian idea. And unlike the other Protestant states, it doesn't go into individualism, but more towards this militarized. So it's a knightly ideal, but it's a knightly ideal that's freed from sort of the feudal caste distinctions in Catholicism, where you have the church, the knights, the landowners. For the Prussian, everyone is sort of this knight serving the state.
It's kind of more. It preserves the medieval hierarchical caste structure, but it's meritocratic. So if you're a peasant, you're not stuck at the bottom. You can work your way up. Yes,
it's giving everyone a opportunity in the state. Now there are titles within Prussia, but the idea of the Prussian respect for the yeoman and the free peasantry, also the idea of civil service in Prussia. You have this great, almost very egalitarian civil service idea where anyone can work for the state and work their way up as a servant of the state.
Yes. Now, a lot of these reforms that we're talking about, the post-Napoleonic reforms, though those were instituted by men like Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and that was in part inspired by the French Revolution. It's like they were looking at the strengths of it and then ignoring the more radical terror that followed and taking those strengths and combining it with their own Germanic culture.
Yeah, so the French Napoleonic invasion sort of forced a lot of these small feudal kingdoms to amalgamate into larger political structures. And so it broke Germany out from this basic feudal model towards the idea of the nation state.
Yeah, yeah. Now, this is a slightly off topic, but I don't think the Scandinavian countries of Denmark and Sweden adopted to use the Spenglerian terms, the Viking economic system.
No,
weren't they closer to the Prussian system?
Yes, they were closer to the Prussian system. And why the sort of Scandinavian welfare state, it's kind of almost National Socialist in a sense, that the idea of this state that sort of is designed to help the nation grow, to protect the nation. It's very much a Bismarckian socialist model. This idea of the nation state as caretaker of the working classes. And so you have figures like the Nobel Prize winning Knut Hamsun, who's very much in line with German National Socialists, coming from a Norwegian background. There's this shared mindset with these figures.
Yeah, yeah. It seems that those Protestant nations that adopted Calvinism adopted the Viking spirit, and those Protestant nations that adopted Lutheranism adopted the more medieval spirit of the knight. Yes. For whatever reasons. You mentioned that in Prussia, the individual was sort of seen as his own knight. Like they were all sort of knights in a sense, and they all could contribute to the good of the whole in that same way. That's somewhat analogous to 19th and early 20th century Japan. They said that everybody was a samurai. If you worked in a factory, you were the samurai. And that samurai ethos was cultivated throughout society to encourage the Japanese people to strive for that common objective. And I don't remember the name of the title of the book, but there was a book or essay written by Ernst Jünger where he develops that idea further, where he imagines that nations compete, not necessarily, they compete economically, where each individual is like a soldier in this larger economic war. And when you're working in the factories, creating new materials, it's almost a kind of a medieval joust, like when you have German and British goods compared to one another. It's like, well, I made more reliable, better products than you did, which is a kind of sign of your superiority in this medieval struggle where you don't want to kill the guy. A joust, you don't necessarily want to kill your opponent, but you want to demonstrate superiority over him.
Yes, and Junger's Der Arbeiter, where he develops this idea of the worker as a soldier of technology. So Junger comes out of the First World War and he sees these massive technological forces that are essentially huge engines of destruction. And so for Junger, this worker becomes a sort of political soldier of technology. When he's working, he's not just a mere economic cog, but he's involved in the control of elemental destructive forces. What he saw on the battlefield would be now transposed into the economic sphere. And so you get this almost revolutionary soldier worker ideal that Junger develops in Der Arbeiter, where the worker is all frontline soldier.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting concept. Now, of course, by this point now we're in the 1930s, and the obvious German economic theory now is National Socialism. Now, how is National Socialism similar to what we've discussed in Junger and Zombart and Weber, and how is it different?
Well, it accepts the idea of a national economic. So along the lines of Zombart, it doesn't see itself as a universalist system. It sees itself as an economics specifically tuned to the needs of the German people. So that's where it differs from Marxism, is that whereas Marxism assumes that there's this international economic system that's good for everyone, National Socialism sees itself as a national economic system. Now, where does it, with Junger, National Socialism is less revolutionary than many of the conservative revolutionaries hoped for. Why, I think many of their hopes were dashed in the reaction of the Night of the Long Knives, the purging of the more hard socialist elements from the NS milieu. But at the same time, it does sort of recapitulate some of the conservative revolutionary idea about the state-dominated economics, the idea of particularly a militarized state. But it also necessarily had to make concessions to the old bourgeoisie, the old pre-World War I order, the wealthy. And so it followed somewhere between the hopes of the conservative revolution and a sort of Keynesian economics. It's very much Keynesian and dirigiste, but more so.
Well, didn't Keynes actually dedicate one of his editions of his theory of credit to Hitler and the National Socialists? Because I think he said that in the National Socialist system, one can most completely enforce a Keynesian model.
Yes, National Socialism is very much Keynesian economics. And Keynes was somewhat positive on National Socialism before the obvious issues
before the war. Yeah. Now, in what ways were the conservative revolutionaries like Junger more radical than the Nazis in economic theory and practice?
Well, they had this whole idea of the sort of worker state, particularly with Junger and Niekisch being the national Bolshevik. And so they wanted this sort of very technology-oriented worker state, this idea of the worker as a political soldier rather than as a mere economic functionary. There was also within the National Socialist movement the idea of German socialism articulated by the Strassers, which wanted the second revolution, they called it. They said that the Nazis getting into power was the first revolution, then we needed to have the second revolution where large chunks of the economy would be nationalized and there'd be this huge redistribution of land, as the Prussians had did under von Stein in the Napoleonic era, to give the worker a share in the economy. So the Strassers particularly wanted to have German peasants' councils that would redistribute land, again, from the big magnates to the German peasants. And that was a major sticking point with Hitler, and it came to a head in the Night of the Long Knives, which unfortunately saw the Strassers purged.
Mm-hmm. You know, this idea of the worker state, it actually seems somewhat similar rather to King Camp Gillette, the founder of the Gillette razor company, was a kind of utopian socialist, and he wrote 3 works on utopian socialism. And one of them was called The People's Corporation, and I didn't actually read it. I read a summary of it. And in many ways, this worker state seems to be similar to the People's Corporation, because in the People's Corporation, they essentially all have shares in the company, and that's what gives them the sort of controlling right. And so the company is beholden to the shareholders, but the shareholders are the workers.
Yes. It was the idea of giving the workers, particularly with Strasserism, the workers a share of the German economy. That really stuck in the craw of the big bourgeoisie, the big industrialists, who didn't want to surrender their control over to the workers.
And it's interesting. Mussolini, in his didn't he write the Encyclopedia Britannica entry on fascism?
Yes, in Mussolini, there was this idea that corporations, there would be different corporations in society that would represent the workers, represent the big business, and so they would all have an equal share, in theory. Unfortunately, in fascism in practice, from 1922 up until 1943, you have the large landowners, the big business, their corporation had more say over the corporations of the working people. Now, after Mussolini is overthrown and then rescued by Scorzani, there was the establishment of the Italian Social Republic, which is actually very radically socialist, perhaps the most radically socialist you get under fascism, where you have worker collectives and redistribution of land. Its economic policy was actually guided by a former communist, Nicola Bambacci. And so they pursue this very radical socialist agenda in this Salo rump state for about 2 years before Mussolini is finally killed.
Yeah, it's funny because even Mussolini mentioned that fascists desired worker control. But unlike in the egalitarian socialist milieu, he understood that there would still be hierarchies of betters and lessers, and that it would be tough. It wouldn't be easy. So the working class would have to be sort of educated or eased into that role. And also the sort of how Hitler co-opted the more radical elements. It kind of reminds me of Franco. During the Civil War in Spain, he allied with the Phalangists, and they had hoped that Franco would be the first step in a radical revolution in Spanish social life. But what ended up happening was they became domesticated to Franco's larger purposes and became far less radical and more were kind of a rubber stamp for Franco's policies.
Yes, yes. And there were dissident Phalangists after Franco. Most of the important Phalangists, like Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera and Ramiro Ledesma Ramos, they were killed during the war, and they were quite radical in their belief about a syndicalist society where you'd have cooperatives of workers. Now, these cooperatives would have hierarchy within them, but you would have cooperatives of workers controlling the economy, and there'd also be great redistribution of land. Now, the big Phalangist names were killed during the war, and so by the time the Civil War is over, you have the Phalangist leadership is basically decapitated, and it's easily rallied into the Franco line, which becomes an excuse for the more reactionary big land ownership groups. Now, there were dissident Phalangists who survived, and they became a sort of thorn in the side to the Franco regime. They supported alternative candidates to the Spanish throne, particularly the Carlists. And in 1976, after the death of Franco, there was an uprising of this sort of left-wing Phalangism that wanted sort of a autogestionary socialism, a non-aligned foreign policy. They were looking towards Tito's Yugoslavia, particularly, where they had this sort of market socialism that had workers' control, workers' cooperatives. They also were very much into the non-aligned foreign policy. And this comes to a head in 1976 in the Monteura massacre, where these supporters of Carlo Hugos, the alternative to Juan Carlos, who had thrown his lot in with these dissident Phalangists, they were massacred by Gladio operatives, essentially, who were worried that Spain would go along this dissident Phalangist line and break away from the U.S. sort of Atlanticist foreign policy.
Interesting. One of the themes of, to backtrack a little bit, of Spengler's work, and I think it's partly overstated but also partly correct, is he argues that socialist thinking to some extent is rooted in Christianity itself. He points to the Catholic works of the Utopia by Thomas More and Campanella's The City of the Sun. And these are both very and they're both conceived in a kind of monastic sense. And so with Thomas More's Utopia and Campanella as the city of the sun, you have these essentially almost monastic socialist societies. So it actually seems like the monastery, that expression of Christian piety, the monastery, is in some sense the sort of a germ from which a later socialist thinking would arise. It would seek to apply that way of life to the whole society.
Yes, absolutely. I think perhaps the benefit that Protestantism gave to Prussia was it provided for a life outside of the clergy that would be essentially part of this Christian state. Whereas for Catholicism, involvement in this monastic order was strictly limited to the clergy, celibate, no families. Protestantism takes this monastic ethos and it makes it a part of the wider society. So that's where it comes into play in Prussia.
Yeah, I know it seems so counterintuitive that, this most Catholic of institutions that the Protestants generally loathed, they ended up becoming the propagators of. It's kind of a strange irony.
Yes, it's very odd that in sort of the British sense that the monasteries are the most hated thing in the British, and you get this cutthroat landowner capitalism in Britain, whereas in the Prussian sense, you're sort of developing off this monastic state.
It's almost like in England that trajectory of the monastic tradition was cut short arbitrarily by Henry VIII. But even in Protestant Germany, though, that didn't happen. And it's almost like the idea of it evolved beyond the walls of the cloister. It continued to evolve beyond the walls of the cloister, creating, the Prussian state.
Yes, yes. That the fundamental crux of Henry VIII's quarrel with the church was he wanted to take the church's power. He was not so much a radical Protestant, so he didn't want to sort of spread the church's power to the various classes of society disenfranchised by the church. He wanted to seize the power for himself.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Anglican Church itself was very similar to Catholicism, and that's why the Presbyterians and the Puritans were so upset, and that's what eventually led to the English Civil War, among other things.
Yes, yes.
So, now, you mentioned the Strassers. Is there anything more you'd like to say about them?
Well, I would say that the Strassers represent sort of the most radical form and sort of the recapitulation of all these Prussian socialist themes and the National Socialist milieu. So they come from a very strong working class background, and interestingly, the Strassers come from a Catholic background, but they gained their strength from the Prussian Protestants in the north, the Gauleiters of the National Socialists in Germany. So particularly their impact on geopolitics, like many conservative revolutionaries, they were not so radical in their anti-communism. They did not believe that Germany should be communist. However, they were looking towards the USSR and said that the USSR had, under Bolshevism, created this Russian version of National Socialism, and that we shouldn't be antagonistic towards the USSR. We should remain neutral, possibly be willing to cooperate. And that was a big controversy in the Nazi Party in 1926. And originally, Goebbels had been on the side of the Strassers, and he confided in his diary that listening to Hitler attack the Strassers, he was losing confidence in Hitler. And so Goebbels was nearly purged for his proximity to the Strassers in the Night of the Long Knives. I think his denunciations of communism afterwards and his denunciations of the Strassers became more hyperbolic to prove his loyalty to Hitler. But under the Strassers, you had this almost perfectly Germanic form of very radical socialism that was not referencing internationalist economic theories like Marxism, but was willing to take the ideas of the class struggle, apply it, was willing to take the ideas of the nation and the class and apply those. And so it's a great missed opportunity for German National Socialism, and it would have been very interesting to see where Germany would have gone under a Strasserist NS leadership. I don't think that Germany would have gotten into this horrid mess in the Second World War, attacking the Soviet Union in particular, under the Strasser. So it's this great what-if moment in German socialism that definitely deserves more credit. And afterwards, after the war, you see groups like Otto Rehmer, who was very strong with Hitler, but moving towards a more Strasserist viewpoint, particularly in regards to the Soviet Union. He advocated neutrality rather than cooperating with the new West German United States, and the Socialist Reich Party that recapitulates many of the ideas of Strasser. And Strasser, the surviving Strasser brother, actually meets with Jean Thuriart, who becomes this figure of a pan-European national state, a sort of national Bolshevik, hard socialist, national socialist. And so the Strassers have a second life after the war, influencing these radical nationalist groups that are moving away from the anti-communism of the Hitlerist milieu.
Yeah, Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, where he thaws relations with the Soviet Union, was that in some sense vaguely influenced by the Strasserite position?
Probably not, though I would say that within the German, West German nationalist consciousness, there's a sort of skepticism of American domination, this idea that maybe Germany should have its own foreign policy, that it shouldn't be dictated to it by the West. And so you get this idea that there maybe could be a rapprochement between East and West, and this idea of the German special path. That is, in terms of its intellectual heritage, a conservative revolutionary one. This idea that Germany occupies this station between the East and West, and that it shouldn't be servile to a separate camp.
It should keep its options open. But you know, we've been talking a lot about land reform and how a lot of these different political movements sought to undermine the power of the large corporations or the large landlords and give land back to the workers. In many ways, England had a smaller, less influential philosophy based on a similar position, and that's distributism. And I think there's certain similarities between distributism and what we've mentioned here, where land should be returned to the people to give them a stake in society.
Yes, and it's very funny that there's a certain land reform that happens under the old Labour governments in the post-World War II era in England, where you have the idea of council houses and these cooperative housing estates where you have a share in it. So this idea comes back again in a very sort of Keynesian, watered-down form.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're about out of time now, so thanks for coming on, Eugene. Is there any place that people could find you if they wanted to learn more about your positions?
Sure, you could find me on Facebook, email me at emontsalvat@gmail.com. You can follow my various blogs, the Nietzsche Translation Project, the Disintegration of the System. That's about it.
All right, well, thanks for coming on, Eugene. This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast, signing off.